Hi, I'm Ken Howard, and welcome to the Gay Therapy LA podcast. Today, I'd like to talk about the 6 principles of sexual health as applied to gay men. I've been enjoying my relatively recent completion of the Certified Sex Therapist credential from AASECT, A-A-S-E-C-T. It's an acronym that stands for the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And that's the national association in the United States, and it's really the highest level of sex therapist certification that's regarded for sex therapists. Now, I don't just do sex therapy. I'm, an all-purpose psychotherapist who specializes in gay men and gay male couples for 29 years now. But after completing an 18-month continuing education program, old dog, new tricks, for therapists provided by the Sexual Health Alliance, which is a continuing education training program for people seeking credentials from AASECT. My mentor was Dr. David Ley, L-E-Y. Yes, I know it's funny that a guy named Dr. Ley was all about sex therapy, but, it's just one of those little ironic names. But and it goes with a very, very nice and inspiring and wise man, the very wise author of several books, but 2 in particular that stand out. The Myth of Sex Addiction, where he challenges the sex addiction model. There's really no such thing to serious sexologists and serious sex therapists. Sex addiction is considered a hyped, over-commercial concept that's really not supported by science. And another book called Ethical Porn for Dicks. Now, there's kind of a humor and a wink in that title, but he really addresses, again, this idea of porn addiction, which is also a myth, and really talks about ethical use of porn in its discussion. So those are 2 very important books on sexual health. He's also written another one called Insatiable Wives and the Men Who Love Them. And that's about desire discrepancy, but has a little bit more heterosexual focus, I think. But this idea of sexual health has been a long-held interest of mine. I started my career really being inspired by the height of the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s and wanting to do something about the AIDS crisis. So instead of becoming a doctor, I became a therapist and became an expert on HIV and AIDS mental health. So along with that came the behavioral and cognitive and emotional aspects of dealing with an HIV diagnosis and dealing with HIV prevention. And I did a lot of this work, in Los Angeles. And so because of that, I've always had sexual health as part of a theme in doing LGBT affirmative work in general and affirmative work for gay men in particular. So, and I help gay men who are both single and in relationships achieve, hopefully, a better sexual health for themselves. So somewhat recently, Doug Braun-Harvey, that's Braun-Harvey, H-A-R-V-E-Y, he is a licensed marriage and family therapist in San Diego, California, and Michael Vigorito, V-I-G-O-R-I-T-O, if you want to look him up. He's also an LMFT in Washington, D.C. And Doug Braun-Harvey and Michael Vigorito co-wrote a book called Treating Out-of-Control Sexual Behavior. And that was an alternative that they have developed to the sex addiction model, which is much more sex-positive, much more science-based, and much more compelling. And within that book, they identified something called the 6 principles of sexual health. Now, there may be other principles, and you could argue some of them, but their discussion of the 6 principles of sexual health really caught on as being a standout portion of that book. And, so their approach to treating out-of-control sexual behavior, I recommend the book, was an alternative to the exploitive and poorly researched and sex-negative sex addiction treatment and the kind of fad of recent years, this pop psychology. which is quickly falling out of favor despite its media hype and very lucrative commercialization. So, like many other psychotherapists, theorists, and authors, such as Marsha Linehan, PhD, who basically invented dialectical behavioral therapy, initially to reduce the number of patients committing suicide from borderline personality disorder, Braun-Harvey and Vigorito looked at the prevailing treatment models for people who thought their sexual behavior felt out of control, and whether it really was or not. But they asked, can we do better? And their groundbreaking book, Treating Out of Control Sexual Behavior, answered this question in the affirmative. Can we do better? So, in a recent AASECT-approved continuing education seminar with the Sexual Health Alliance, of which I'm also a graduate from, was taught by Dr. David Lay, he discussed these 6 principles of sexual health again, and how therapists can use them to help clients in therapy with sexual concerns. So after this was all part of the continuing education that sex therapists need to undertake. It was a full weekend in March of 2021. And it's what we need continuing education to keep the credential, even after 18 months of education to get it. So there's a lot of training for certified sex therapists. But after Dr. Lay talked about the 6 principles, I decided to take this a step further and discuss how these can apply more specifically to gay men of all ages. Let's talk about the World Health Organization and sexual health. So, according to the World Health Organization, which Trump, in his usual fits of anger, got the United States out of, and President Biden recently restored United States participation in the World Health Organization, they had defined sexual health as the state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being related to sexuality. It is not merely the absence of disease, dysfunction, and infirmity. Sexual health requires a positive, respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences, free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. For sexual health to be attained and maintained, the sexual rights of all persons must be respected, protected, and fulfilled. And that's a quote from the World Health Organization. So that last word, fulfilled, is one that I think is important. It's perhaps somewhat easier to think in terms of disease prevention, such as Truvada and now Descovy for PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV prevention, use of condoms, etc. But World Health Organization makes a good point in that sexual health also involves the quest for all concerned to be fulfilled. And a lot of guys I work with as clients, gay male clients, and we're talking about sex therapy topics, they come to me because they're complaining that they're not feeling fulfilled in their sexual selves, either single or partnered with one or more partners in polyamory, for example, and they want to be fulfilled. And this can form the basis of their work with sex therapy with me as a gay men specialist, certified sex therapist. So let's talk about these 6 principles of sexual health that were identified by Braun-Harvey and Vigorito, both gay men, by the way. And these were 6. They were identified as this. Number 1 is consent. Number 2 is non-exploitation. Number 3 is protection from HIV, STIs, sexually transmitted infections, and unwanted pregnancy. Number 4 is honesty. Number 5 is shared values. And number 6 is mutually pleasurable. Again, that last one, mutually pleasurable, is a more nuanced discussion than merely the absence of disease, dysfunction, or infirmity, as the World Health Organization said. And Dr. Lay points out that so much in sexuality is what he calls stop signs. We want to stop out-of-control behavior. We want to stop offending our religion of our upbringing. We want to stop anything that makes us feel bad. And those can be important to varying degrees for different people, But he wisely makes the point of asking where the go signs are in our sexuality. What do we enjoy? What do we currently do that we would like to keep doing or do even more of? What makes us attain that fulfillment that World Health Organization mentions? So let's take a closer look at those 6 principles. And for each one, we might talk about what's different in sexual play among gay men versus straight people. So for each of these 6, I'm going to offer a discussion of as applied to gay men after each one. So let's take all 6. So number 1 is consent. So recently, with the hashtag #MeToo discussion in media and journalism about sexual harassment in the workplace, there has been a welcome increase in social awareness and just a sensitivity to societal ills such as date rape, rape within marriage, sexual harassment in the workplace, which goes way beyond, Hollywood tabloid stories, sexual assault, especially in the military, that's a big problem, and an increased understanding of just what constitutes consent, which can be withdrawn at any point in the sexual encounter. There is also the role of consensual non-consent in BDSM and kink play that needs its own consideration. Consent is known as a legal, ethical, social, interpersonal, and emotional concept, and the increased attention to consent relatively lately just goes to show how much magnitude of exploitation there's been throughout history, often against cisgender or trans women, but against others too. I was sexually harassed by a male supervisor at a nonprofit organization right as I was getting licensed as a licensed clinical social worker in California when I was a young clinician back in the 90s. And since then, I have worked with many gay men, straight and gay, who have faced the same issue. And it's not about gender, it's about power imbalance, such as an aggressive supervisor, again, of any gender, who holds the power of continued livelihood, or promotion, or salary, or housing, or access to health insurance and medical care over their victim, who can also be any gender. Violations about consent are all too frequent when we're talking about people with the narcissistic personality disorder who believe that power is something they and they alone are entitled to, selfishly holding someone else's well-being hostage to it. People with disabilities, such as the developmentally disabled or the mentally ill, as well as the elderly and the intoxicated, such as the drunk girl at a frat party passed out, can be especially vulnerable to the narcissist just kind of helping themselves, as Supreme Court justices, presidents, actors, and other famous figures have been accused of. In true consent, the questions need to be asked and answered about yes or no clearly about the sexual acts. So let's apply that to gay men. Consent as applied to gay men. People shouldn't assume that somehow consent doesn't apply to gay men because, it's just guys and guys just want it all the time anyway. I've worked with plenty of gay men who have been victims of the same crimes we hear about against women. Even in consensual non-consent, that involves a specific kind of BDSM and kink play, which has its own rules to be considered mutually beneficial. Guys who are straight, bisexual, or in the closet might be especially vulnerable to exploitation when there's alcohol or drugs or some kind of power imbalance involved. We need to challenge this idea that only women are victims of sexual crimes, even if they are in the majority of those victimized, by straight men who have been brought up to exploit others as part of being a man. Male rape and sexual assault survivors of all sexual orientations face the double trauma of being both assaulted and stigmatized or disbelieved. Gay men who have had consent violated are experiencing yet one more way that gay men's sexuality is invalidated, as if they didn't have the same rights as everyone else. For everyone, healthy sex has an aspect that is both or more partners are engaging in the sexual acts on a level playing field and with equal social power. So number 2 is non-exploitative. So important questions to ask include what, if any, are the power imbalances between or among the parties having sex? Is there any information being withheld from one partner, such as portraying oneself as being single when they're actually partnered or married? Is there some kind of a secondary gain involved, such as workplace harassment? See above, again, on what true consent means. Sex without consent is inherently exploitive. And sex that has a primarily commercial function is often seen as exploitive, such as human trafficking, exploitation of children, and other acts made famous recently by Trump and Jeffrey Epstein and all these people in the news, Matt Gaetz recently, all these Republican politicians who've been at least accused and even many times, such as Trump, settled lawsuits from alleged victims of sexual assault, including minors. And that's something that's been, in the news pretty well hidden. But someone having sex with someone to get back at their ex, or merely to satisfy a curiosity, like seeing if a deaf person still moans in sex like a hearing person would, that would be considered exploitive. And by the way, that's a true story from my high school days with a straight friend, which I thought was kind of creepy. Sex to gain some kind of favor, or to prevent the levying of some kind of punishment, like a teacher or a student who's failing a class. They can get a bad grade by sleeping with the professor. That's unethical. That's exploitive. A boss or employee, as we said, a cop and a citizen, a vendor and a client. All of these would fall into the exploitive category. And exploitive sex does not imply sound sexual health. So let's apply non-exploitive to gay men. So one could argue that an older gay guy having sex with a younger gay guy who's being objectified for his youth and beauty could be considered exploitive in kind of this twink sugar daddy arrangement, or even a younger gay guy who is having sex with an older gay guy to manipulate him into monetary or commercial gains would be too. Same with objectification of someone by having sex with them because they're rich or famous, the old starfucker label, or a racial ethnic stereotype, the big black bull man, or merely because of a physical attribute. So, I did a previous blog article on gaytherapyla.com/blog, which if you haven't visited there, I encourage you to, gaytherapyla.com/blog, and all the blog articles are there, and you can search on topics you like. But I wrote an article on the dating pitfalls of cash, connections, and cock. And I think we might have done a previous podcast episode on that. But we want to say when you're dating, you want to avoid dating for the wrong reasons. And cash, connections, and cock are the wrong reasons. So healthy sex has to pass a certain two civilians test and be reasonably free of some kind of power imbalance that one participant has over the other. So that was non-exploitation. Number 3 is protection from HIV and STIs and unwanted pregnancy. So there's been a lot of discussion about this. Throughout the AIDS crisis proper, keyword use of condoms was a very reliable means of HIV prevention. Even if some sexual conservatives, such as the Catholic Church, tried to challenge or undermine that message. They tried to say that condoms weren't effective at preventing HIV when actually scientific data proved that they were to a very, very large extent. And the advent of PrEP, taking first Truvada, now Descovy, which is a kind of new and improved version of Truvada that is less hard on the kidneys. The advent of PrEP was very controversial, and I have a blog article on that called The Mental Health Aspects of PrEP. It was, by some figures, labeled a party drug, or it was labeled as unreliable, when again, the scientific data shows that PrEP, when taken daily, is incredibly reliable at preventing HIV. So with either Truvada or Descovy. And while critics of PrEP argue that, well, it doesn't protect against everything, such as syphilis or gonorrhea or HPV, that doesn't constitute a reason not to use it. It's been shown with very reliable data to be highly effective when used daily or even less than daily in what they call the 2-1-1-1, 2 pills before, an hour before sex, 1 pill after, and 1 pill the next day. There's the details on that. You'd want to do a Google search on PrEP 2-1-1 or PrEP on demand. But taking PrEP daily, 1 pill once a day each day, has been known to be very effective at preventing HIV. And then, so STI management for sexually active people, of all kinds, not just gay men, involves things like regular testing at your doctor or at some kind of a free clinic or something like that. And then if they find something, if you come up positive for syphilis or gonorrhea or anything, even if you're not symptomatic, then they can treat you, and then it prevents it being a public health problem from being prevalent. And so increased surveillance, such as regular STI testing and treatment, is an important component of self-esteem and self-care and sexual health. So let's apply that prevention of HIV, STIs, and unwanted pregnancy to gay men. So gay men do have, according to statistics, a higher recorded prevalence of syphilis at times, especially in American cities. So gay men are encouraged to have regular screenings, although it's not limited to them. It's called the RPR blood test, and that'll test for syphilis. And then if you have it, then you usually have to do just 1 big dose of penicillin. But gay men used to make a joke out of preventing unwanted pregnancy because we're gay, we can't get each other pregnant, right? But since we can now sometimes find cisgender gay men sexually involved with transmasculine individuals, pregnancy at times can be considered a possible risk. So guys who are more fluid in their sexual identity might also be having some vaginal sex, and considerations to prevent unwanted pregnancy still apply with bisexual men or even gay-identified men who are not exclusive to MSM, men who have sex with men, play. The idea of talking about and discussing these issues can be considered a part of sexual health and even one of consent. These principles overlap a bit. And as the saying goes, with all these, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And part of being a sexually skilled and empowered individual at pleasing yourself and a partner includes a knowledge of how to keep unwanted outcomes at bay. Rationally managing these risks can be a part of the gay men's specialty therapy that I provide in what's called psychoeducation. Psychoeducation is something educational and factual, but that has a psychological aspect to it. And it can also be a part of cognitive behavioral therapy to manage actual risk or to manage irrational fears about the risk of contagion, which many gay men still have about HIV. I work with a number of guys where they have either an anxiety or a phobia or even a panic around a fear of HIV and sexually transmitted infections that is out of proportion to their risk. So sometimes what we talk about is what they're doing or what they'd like to do, and we talk about what is reasonable HIV and STI prevention versus what would be irrational, almost like an obsessive compulsive disorder. And, if you're one of those guys, we need to talk. So, and that you want to look at reasonable HIV prevention, and that takes education and getting good information from good public health sources or people who know this stuff because we've studied it, like me. So number 4 is honesty. Dr. Lay, in giving this presentation, discussed a challenging question of how transparent one is with their partner. Are you good at expressing your sexual needs and desires and preferences and even anti-preferences, things you specifically don't like in sex? Do you keep your agreements about a monogamy agreement with your partner? Or do you keep agreements about the ground rules of your open relationship in consensual non-monogamy? I'm in a program now for a certificate in consensual non-monogamy with Sexual Health Alliance, and there's a lot of that. Studies range from recently only 30% of gay couples to as many as 50% or more of gay male couples have some version of consensual non-monogamy or monogamish, the allowance of outside partners, in agreement in the relationship and not just cheating, agreeing to a monogamous relationship and then not holding it. That's just cheating. So think about this principle, think about yourself in your heart of hearts. How honest have you been lately with others or with yourself? Honesty is not only not doing something naughty, but it's also validating to yourself of what you do like sexually. Be honest with yourself about, thinking about what you like, even if it's something kinky or something embarrassing. There's really no sexual fantasy or fetish that you can have that isn't shared by many, many, many other people. So you want to validate those feelings. And again, if the sex that you're having or the kink sex that you want to have falls within these 6 principles of sexual health, then it kind of passes a certain social test. Consenting adults, that kind of thing. And we can say that honest sex is healthy sex. Now let's apply this to gay men. Gay men can, like others, have, occasional problems with honesty. I work with a lot of couples where the problem that they're bringing to me for help is that one of them has been dishonest. And I hear this a lot in my practice. We get away from practicing honesty when shame gets in the way of proudly owning and discussing and asserting what we feel with others. As gay men, we know all about shame from the minority stress of a still generally homophobic society. It depends on what city you're in the United States or what country you're in across the world. But, let's face it, gay men still have a lot of minority stress from homophobic corners of the world and factions in it, particularly religious conservatives in these places, where it's everything from discrimination to state-sanctioned murder. And so in the context of this pressure, gay men grow up with the creation of the false self. Alan Downs talked about that in his book, The Velvet Rage, that gay men create a false self growing up, in order to be safe and to get by. But, that also deals with a lot of shaming that's internalized. And, with shame, it's a very short trip to lying in order to save face. So validating ourselves, being our authentic self, speaking our truth, even if we have to negotiate and navigate areas of disagreement with our partner, is part of sexual health. If we want to consider some version of consensual non-monogamy, then we need to validate that feeling on ourselves and talk about it with a partner, or maybe get help from a gay savvy therapist or sex therapist about what that might look like. Or if you have been, honestly, guilty of being dishonest, then you want the opportunity to explore that and talk about what pressures you were under to lie in order to avoid discussion or even to avoid responsibility. So there's a saying, I'm not in AA, but I like to steal their sayings, Alcoholics Anonymous, you're only as sick as your secrets. And so, if you really talk about the things that feel private, even if it makes you blush, then that's an important part of communication in relationships. So number 5 is shared values. Dr. Lay calls this the other safe sex talk, meaning that what having sex means to you and everyone involved needs some discussion. So is any given sexual act, is this a one-time thing, like a hookup, or is it a part of dating? Is there any kind of implied commitment, such as to exclusivity? Some gay men only forego condoms with steady partners or with domestic partners, especially if they're not on PrEP. Do you or more share an interest in what this sex is. How do you feel about only sex in private? How do you feel about some kind of public sex, like at a bathhouse or a sex club or a sex party or something? Do you only like duo sex as a sexual value, or are you open to group? Kind of more vanilla sex or more kink? Are you and your partner essentially on the same page here when it comes to your sex? Is sex a recreational sport fuck, or is it an intimate expression of lovemaking? So ideally, all the partners participating in sex make it all healthier by having a reasonable congruence of shared values in what they're doing together. So let's talk about shared values as applied to gay men. Now, just like with straight people, and I've learned in my trainings for AASECT that straight people can be every bit as kinky as gay men, if not more so, because their sex is, of all kinds, is generally more socially supported by the majority. So gay men can have many varied values. The same gay man might have lovemaking style sex with a long-term partner early in the day and have a casual hookup with an outside partner later the same day or the same week. But in both cases, hopefully the man and his respective partners understand the nature of the sexual encounters for what they are. When there are not shared values, there needs to be a candid discussion, sometimes in the moment and sometimes as a topic for partners in a sex therapy session. Many times gay domestic partners or spouses can slowly erode eroticism in favor of comfort and familiarity, which on the one hand implies emotional intimacy and a profound bond in a long-term relationship, and then on the other hand it can be a damper on the exciting aspects of eroticism. Candid discussion and negotiations can help identify which values, the intimacy and the familiarity versus an intense eroticism, they want to assert, and with whom, and when and where. Because really this idea of shared values, gay men might have different values at different times and for different needs. We would have the emotional need of connecting to a partner intimately, and then we also might have erotic needs. And sometimes they would be met by the same person, and sometimes they would be met by different people. And that needs to be discussed about where does it all happen to get those needs met as part of shared values. So number 6, the last one in the principles of sexual health, is mutually pleasurable. Now, the religious conservative views of sex among some evangelicals or Muslims or Catholics and Orthodox Jews have historically tended to undermine, ignore, or even aggressively invalidate the role of women's sexual pleasure in sex, in yet another patriarchal structure. The old-fashioned advice of mothers to newlywed daughters for their wedding night, for their first time having sex, was, just lay there and think of England. While the man, has his way with her, his husbandly duties, whatever. And part of male dominance in world cultures across the world and throughout history, implied that sex was only for men's pleasure, especially in comparison to women. But in more modern progressive views of sexual health, the pleasure of both or all parties involved is seen as important in, hopefully, relatively equal ways. So if both or all partners in the sexual act are not having pleasure, including ironic things such as a sadomasochistic pleasure, then the act is probably imbalanced in some way and lacks ideal sexual health. So number 6, let's talk about mutually pleasurable as applied to gay men. So even a brief conversation with many gay men will tell you that they tend to like sex a lot, which, this is true for most, if not all humans, and maybe not all humans, because there are asexuals, which need its own discussion. Gay men not only take the sexual from an interpersonal act of mutual pleasure, but it extends into a cultural identity celebration. See the annual Pride celebrations. As a sexual minority, and we have Pride celebrations to celebrate specifically our sexuality because it is a defense against the idea of historical oppression. That's why we have Pride every year, is to fight back a little bit against the widespread historical oppression of LGBT people in general and gay men in particular over centuries. Not only is the gay male couple having mutually pleasurable sex, but those who support them are receiving pleasure in knowing about it. Perhaps up to a point. There is a place for discretion. But, the only people who aren't being pleased with many sexual acts outside those directly involved are the ones who have a strong investment in policing the sex of other consenting adults by forcing their idea of morality on others, especially via religious oppression and its attempts to codify bigotry into law, such as the recent religious freedom bills in many states in the United States. These are from people who want to oppress the broader LGBT community and gay men in particular, because these people don't like the sex their fellow citizens are having or are interested in. So in this way, we could say that the sexual health principle of mutually pleasurable pertains to the actors involved and not the social commentary around it extraneously. It's none of your business, as the Supreme Court ruling in Lawrence v. Texas, striking down sodomy laws attested. That in America, gay adults have an implied right to privacy under the U.S. Constitution when it comes to their own sexuality in private or certain limited public spaces, such as a play space or a dungeon or a bathhouse or a sex club. But if the sex you're having isn't mutually pleasurable, it's important to avoid, the self-abandonment, the low self-esteem, and the lack of assertiveness that's inherent in not speaking up. Speak up. Assert and advocate for the kind of sexual life that you want to have and the type of sexual being that you want to be. You have the right to expect a reasonable consideration of the principle of mutual pleasure in the sex that you're having. Let's talk about sex as life-affirming, including for gay men. For too long in history, sex has been plagued, pun intended, right, because of the AIDS crisis, by some kind of negativity or oppression or disease or sexism or heterosexism and homophobia, strict moralism, racism, violations of the principles of sexual health. And through social movement and scholarship with a clinical application to real people, such as the work of Braun-Harvey and Vigorito, we are working to move society forward to a greater global awareness at this time in history for increased social justice by way of increased sexual health. See the connection there? Social justice is connected to the sexual health of individuals and our sex partners and even whole groups like gay men or other subgroups of the population. If we identify these 6 sexual health principles and apply them to our lives, we support the individual and the conjoint, such as couples or small groups, and then the macro society toward this goal of social justice. So, just like medical care and temperature and climate control and good hydration and good nutrition and protection from the natural elements, sexuality is a part of human health and is a life-affirming activity, even when it is not, as in the case of gay sex, a life-creating activity. Just because it's not life-creating, we're making babies here, that doesn't mean that it's not life-affirming. And that's what gay and lesbian sex in particular is about, is that it doesn't have to be for procreation to be affirming. Even straight people who are using birth control, they're not creating a baby if they're using birth control, but they're still having life-affirming sex as part of a human relationship. And that can be legitimate, even for a hookup. Sex outside of committed relationships is still legitimate when you're talking about consenting adults who are in it for fun and in it for pleasure. So, ever since Stonewall, and certainly before, Stonewall was not the beginning of gay rights. It's just kind of commemorated to be. Gay men are included in the quest for social justice by way of healthy sexuality. We evolve as a global society that deserves nothing less. So, if you are interested in sex therapy or psychotherapy or a different service that I provide, coaching to guys all over the United States or all over the world, or organizational consulting or speaking, or cleaning, I don't know, I'll come over and clean your drain if I have some Drano or something. We offer a lot of services at Gay Therapy LA, but especially sex therapy and psychotherapy and coaching. So if you are interested, please text or call in the United States 310-339-5778. That's 310-339-5778. Or you can email me, ken@gaytherapyla.com. So remember that gaytherapyla.com is my website for more information about me, about my associate clinicians, about our services, and of course the very large library at this point in my career of archived blog articles. Just go to gaytherapyla.com/blog, find the little search box and search on sex or search on finances or search on career, or whatever you want to search on. And there's probably a blog article in there too. And of course, previous episodes. So I hope you're enjoying the podcast. If you have suggestions for future podcast topics, please let me know. I always appreciate hearing from guys on that. I've got a couple episodes in the works that are suggestions from listeners like you, and as well as future blog articles. And would be happy to be of help in this and other topics at Gay Therapy LA. So thank you, and I'll see you next time.